Well, good evening. Great to have you with us again this week for our Bible study as we look at this idea of having our minds renewed and refreshed and being able to enjoy that sense of well-being and wholeness that comes from biblical teaching about how to be transitioned by the renewing of our minds. And we've been doing quite a series on this, but there is one thing that we haven't touched on yet. And so tonight I just want to unpack a thought for you. And it's really important. And it's this. When God introduces us to the idea of the kingdom of heaven, when God talks about his plan for human beings and how to make our lives better and fulfilled and have that sense of well-being and wholeness, God always does it in a sense of community. God never talks about the individual believer. He talks about the group of believers, and often so much so that he talks about believers as a body, just like a physical body. And so there's this idea tonight when we talk about having a healthy mindset and doing things that are good for us, positive, and have a good influence on our mindsets and our thinking. It is this idea of togetherness. I'm reading from Ecclesiastes chapter 4 and verse 10. And I read this: two are better than one. Well, that's for sure, isn't it? Two are better than one because they have a good return for their physical labor. You know, if you're out there cutting the grass, or whether you're doing gardening, whether you're building, whatever it is you do in life, two people can always do a better job, more efficiently, more effectively than one person on their own. And that's what the writer Solomon says in Ecclesiastes. They have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. And that's kind of where we're coming at with all this, is think about all those people in life who fall down, maybe not physically fall down, but mentally, emotionally, their resilience fails and they find there's a moment in life when they're crashing and they're burning and things aren't good, and either they're taking it out on other people, and that's so often the case. We hear so many stories of people who aren't coping with life. And what they do, they tend to turn that negative experience against those around them. The people that would be there to support them, love them, are always the ones who end up being the victims of other people's negative experience. And so that's the challenge, isn't it? And sometimes, you know, when we fall into difficulties and traps, we can be alone. I forget who said it, but someone's quoted as saying, "You're never more lonely than when you're in a crowd." And there's a difference between being together with others and being in a large group of people. And that's something we need to be conscious of when we talk about togetherness. We're not just talking about being in the crowd. And there's so many, you know, they go after being in a crowd. It's great to be in a crowd because somehow I think I'm part of a successful group. I'm part of a network. This is great. But actually, when I'm going through the difficulties, the challenges, that's when I know if I've got people that I'm together with or whether I'm just alone in a crowd. It's just a really important thought. But as we read this verse, there's more to this, because he says, if two lie down together, they will keep each other warm. How can one keep warm alone? And that's the tragic story, isn't it? So often we read these tragic news stories of people who were homeless, had nobody else. They were on their own and died of hypothermia because they were literally freezing to death in the cold with nowhere to go. And that's something that Ecclesiastes touches on, is this idea that being alone is not a good thing. Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. And a cord of 3 strands is not quickly broke. And it's a great idea when we read these verses that what the Bible's teaching us is, there is strength in unity. There is strength in being together. There is strength in looking out for one another and holding one another up. There's something really powerful about being connected in a positive and healthy relationship with others. And that's what this is all about tonight, is the idea of having a really good, healthy support network. When the Bible talks about how God created men and women, we are told in Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, that the Lord God said, "It's not good for man to be alone. I'll make a helper suitable for him." And even God, in making man in his own image, and we're not going to talk a lot about that stuff tonight, but even in that moment, God recognized that man on his own struggles. But with someone alongside him, life can be so different. Our challenge is to make sure that the people alongside us, the people around us, that they are positive, that they've got a good input into our lives and not a negative input. Because so often, when we're bad, we can damage those around us, and then they end up being the victims of our struggles and our bad behavior and our mental and emotional difficulties. And it's a huge challenge. And so sometimes we need to make sure that the person we're with isn't causing us harm, but is helping us and building us up and building a positive support, because that's what God intended in the first place, is firstly through the marriage of a man and a woman together. God ordained that a man and woman should get married and be of mutual help to one another. It's not just about the physical things, it's about that being together and not alone. But we know in this broken world of ours, relationships are often one of the most damaging and damaged things we go through. And so there's a challenge, isn't it, is making sure that we put our positives in to help others to put their positives in. And it's a great thing to do, to learn how to be in positive relationships and learn about relationships. But even God says it's not good, for men to be alone. In fact, the writer to the Psalms, he says this in Psalm 133. He says, how good, how pleasant it is for brothers to live together, to dwell together in unity. And that's where we're going with this tonight, is this idea that it's one thing to be in a crowd and know lots of people. It's another thing to have a sense of community and people that you feel safe and you feel you can trust, who you're able to share the difficulties and challenges you go through with, who are able not to just meddle in your life or give you crazy advice, but just be supportive and encouraging. And that is what we're talking about. That was God's ordained way for men and women and society in general to be. So when we look at the mess around us, that's not God's plan for humanity. That is the brokenness of sin and the devil's program to confuse and hurt and cause upset and damage and brokenness, and just to spread that across this whole planet. And look what a mess we get into every 5 minutes. But when we get into God's way, we realize that healthy relationships, good, supporting relationships, can be so positive and invaluable in our lives. And that's what we're talking about this evening. Message version says, how wonderful, how beautiful when brothers and sisters get along. And I think it's a beautiful picture of, there are so many voices in society and in life, even in our own individual lives, in a local level. There's so many voices and so many influences and inputs, and so many of them demanding that we affiliate with this, or we align ourselves with that we have this political opinion, or we have this ethical view, or we have this particular community standpoint. And people try and draw us all over the place. And at the end of the day, while it's nice for people to encourage us to consider these things, what's really important is that people in our community, our local small support group community, have our backs. That whether we want to believe what they believe or sign up for what they want to sign up for, that doesn't matter. As long as when we're in trouble, they're there to help. Because that's the acid test, isn't it? That's the proof that somebody is in our corner. And a good way is when we're in hard times and hard places, the ones that are for you are the ones who are stepping up to help. And that's how you can tell a friend. They often say when things are going good, you have a whole host of people around you. But when you fall on hard times and hard places, when you go through difficult things with your own mental and emotional well-being, it's surprising how few people are really around. And so we just encourage you tonight to think about this whole thing and how important it is that we have really good, solid support networks around us. When I look at the early church and I see what started to happen when Jesus was taken from this earth and the Holy Spirit was poured out, I begin to see some patterns that were going on in the early church, and they're really important. And we see post-COVID how many people have gotten out the habit of being together and not realizing how much they're losing out on this critical support network that God put in place as part of what we call the church. In the early days, they called it the ecclesia, the gathering of the believers. But, today we use church. I think church misdirects us a little bit from what God was trying to let us see when he brought us together in this community of believers. Because we read that when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. That they'd got into this habit of coming together and spending time together. Sometimes we use the word fellowship. In the Greek, the phrase is koinonia, and what it means is not just a gathering of people, but actually meaningful connections where we spend time in relationship, taking time to talk to one another and care about one another. And I'm sure as they were talking and caring for one another in the early church, that when one had a problem, another one was praying, someone else was perhaps offering practical support and help. But together, that whole community was supporting one another. And we know in the early days of the church, they had really challenging times. And so that's something that we see, that their support for one another was critical in the early days of the church. And it is no less critical today. And then again, I read this, that all believers were together and they had everything in common. In other words, there was kind of a like mindset. This is what we're about. This is what our lives are about. And this is something that brings us together. Even though we might have nothing else in common, this one thing unites us, that we all believe in Jesus Christ. And so you see this huge, huge influence as people become believers, followers of Jesus. In the early days, they just said they were followers of the way. And what was happening was they were looking out for one another. They were taking care of one another. They didn't think about what was mine and what was yours. Instead, they thought about, well, if I've got and you don't, then here, have some of mine. They were sharing and taking care of one another and looking out for one another. And I know in the 21st century, that's a very complicated idea to try and see that revived. But we see that genuineness of heart, that people were willing to take of what they had and share with others to help. And we still see that today in churches, this idea of people buying shopping and bringing it along to a food program, or buying clothing or baby equipment for a baby program, or giving money to help in other practical support programs, because that's all part of us having these things in common. And so I see this in the early church. And this is what I see when I talk about God's idea of community. Because God's idea of community is not just about a mass gathering with lots of numbers. Because that just makes the person at the front, or the handful of people at the front, look good. But actually, the body of Christ is about everybody doing their part and everybody sharing and taking part in the well-being and the good of the whole. So the work doesn't fall on the shoulders of the few, but everybody takes their part and steps up and is part of this community of well-being and support. And that's God's idea of community. When we read in Hebrews, the writer to Hebrews in chapter 10, he says, some people have given up the habit of meeting for worship, but we must not do that. We should keep on encouraging each other. And there's this idea that so often there aren't so many spaces and times when we're available. Many have to go to work for a job on set hours during the week, so they're not available during the day. Others are retired. Others perhaps not got a job at all, but busy doing other things. And so life is so full and so busy that finding time to come together and be together can seem like such a demand on our scarce resources when we think about how finite time is and how much time we want to spend with family, how much we want to do things with friends, our own personal hobbies and social interests. And so by the time you've covered all that, there's very little time left for this thing that we call church. But what we forget, and this is why the writer to Hebrews is really trying to stress this, is what we forget is that when we're in a God community, being a part of that community, we've got as much responsibility to come and give, not necessarily financially, but give encouragement, to give someone a listening ear, give someone time, and at the same time knowing that if we're in a place where we're having a hard time and find it hard going, that there are those who are there to listen to us. It's no good putting a brave face on it, as it were, and just saying to everybody, I'm fine, everything's okay, but never being around in the church. Because what that tells me is actually maybe things aren't okay. I'm distracted, I'm not interested, I'm not doing my part, and maybe I actually need the help and the support of my support community around me. And so it's really interesting, isn't it, how whenever we get downhearted and discouraged, the one place that God has created, the space that God has created for us to find encouragement, support, be uplifted, is in the gathering of believers. Not just in a formal service, but having coffee with Christian friends, networking and being together as believers so that we can do this together thing, this fellowship thing. But when we feel down, how often we draw ourselves away. Or what we see on the other side of this is sometimes people can be really hard to be with when they're in a really negative place and they're feeling really downhearted and discouraged. Spending time with them can be really draining. It can be really difficult. We leave and we feel more discouraged than when we met up with them. And that's a whole teaching program of its own about learning to develop our own resilience and building our own strength and spiritual skill. But we mustn't let the state of other people's emotions and spiritual condition put us off. We've got to find ways to draw strength and be the encouragement in their lives. Not just the pastor and the elders and the church counselors. They're all here for specific reasons to help in particular ways. But as a body of believers, when we step up and all share a listening ear and a friendly chat over coffee, not trying to solve people's problems, but just be there for them. What a difference that makes. What a community that makes. What a fellowship that makes. So we read on, and in Ephesians, Paul writes, and he says, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. What he's saying is it's really important that people don't feel pushed away and discouraged. And so do your best. Now, we don't always get it right because sometimes we can't do right for wrong because no matter how hard we try, some people will always say, well, I'm not happy and it's not good enough. And, well, that's okay. Be blessed. We accept that not everybody's going to feel that everything works for them. And some people just need everything perfect, and we can't be perfect because we're all broken humanity, all making our way on this journey. But we realize that for the majority of people, what Paul is saying is this: do your best. Find ways to be at peace with one another. Keep this unity thing, this shared heart and common interest thing. Keep this love for one another going, this important center of care for one another, so that when you get together, it's always around a heart and an attitude of care and concern for each other's well-being. It's so important. And so I see this. And then I read in the Psalms, and some could say that this is almost a prophetic psalm about Jesus Christ on the cross. But at the same time, the psalmist writes, "Scorn has broken my heart and has left me helpless. I looked for sympathy, but there was none. For comforters, but I found none." What a dreadful place to be. And what a dreadful thought that somebody might be in a place where they feel ridiculed, derided, they might feel really downhearted and need somebody just to give them a sense of well-being and encouragement. Excuse me. And the idea that someone might come looking and find none of that, well, that's a scary thought, isn't it? And if we ourselves were in need, it's a scary thought that there'd be nobody there. And praise God that God has ordained that his church should be on this earth, that believers should care for one another and for others out in our community. And I've met so many Christians who work in nursing, mental health, in community outreach in different ways to try and help and care. But what we need to do is have a community of care, a fellowship of concern amongst us as believers as well, because that's God's heart, is that when people come in, they wouldn't just feel a sense of acceptance, they would feel a sense of well-being from the way that they are welcomed into everything that's going on. And that's something we've worked at over the years very carefully here, and I'm really just overjoyed with how the believers here are and how they welcome others. But this isn't just a Hope Church thing. This is a biblical thing. This is an all churches thing. This is a we should care for one another and love one another and be concerned for one another. We should be a community of togetherness. And often being together means that people have to feel safe and welcome when they come. I realize as we look at this that we come to this idea that Paul writes his second letter to the church in Corinth, and he talks like this. He said, "The God who comforts us in all our troubles." So he's saying, look, even when there's none to help, God's there. We've got to remember that. God is there. God does help. And sometimes in our desperation, we cry to God, and he sends others alongside us to help, sometimes unexpectedly. And I've heard lots of stories of people who've been in real difficult situations mentally, emotionally, struggling to cope with the troubles of the day, and they've cried out to God, and the next thing, somebody from the church has walked around the corner and bumped into them, and they've known that God's answered their prayer. God does help, and we must never dismiss God and God's ability to send help when it's needed. But I see here this idea that not only does God comfort us in all our troubles, but he comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God. In other words, we're still talking about this idea of God's community of believers being a community of encouragement and support. A mutually beneficial gathering of people who love and care for one another and lift one another in every adversity. And that's a huge thing, isn't it? And as we look at this idea of the receiving comfort, I also see this idea we said at the beginning, that such is the idea of community that God expresses in the New Testament verses, that God talks about the church being like a body, a physical body. And so right into the church in Ephesus, Paul says, from him, that's Jesus, the whole body is joined and held together by every supporting ligament. Not that the head supports everything, but that everything supports each other. Each ligament has its job to do, with the comfort. So each, the body is held together by every supporting ligament and grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. And I've noticed something, that there are times when we go through hard times and hard places and emotional challenges and sometimes even mental health issues, and we take ourselves out of the community. We isolate ourselves and we cut ourselves off from everything and everybody else. And that's not what the body's designed for. In fact, it's the opposite, that we're supposed to embed into the community of believers more when we're having a hard time and finding it hard going. And we're supposed to be people who want to put our effort in, not just people who take when we need and then aren't here when we don't need, but people who come and share this very experience of love, support, and encouragement, and grow in that so that we have more of that to share with others. And so there's a great picture in the Bible about what the church is meant to be and how the church is meant to be, because we know from society, psychologists will tell us that when you've had mental health issues, when you've had emotional traumas and difficulties, and that's not always some of the big psychiatric diagnoses, but sometimes ordinary people regularly go through stress, depression, anxiety, fear, and all sorts of other troubles. And they are all come under that umbrella of mental health and emotional issues. And so when we talk about this stuff, let's not think that it applies to some distant, small group of people. Most people will experience challenges emotionally, especially in terms of fear, anxiety, depression, and stress. Most people will experience those things at least once in their life. And so what God is giving us is this picture that the church is a place where when people are going through those things, they can come in, experience the help, the comfort, the support. And then out of that, they're meant to stick around and be part of the help, the comfort, the support for others when they come in. That's the whole picture of God's community. It's a wonderful picture. And in effect, what God has done is he has provided for us a kingdom of heaven support network for us to have good people around us to encourage and lift us up when we're feeling low. Because, let's be honest, the minute you become a believer, the enemy starts hitting you with all that negativity and trying to pull your heart down and cause you to give up on the faith that has laid hold of you. And this is one of the ways that we guard one another and we watch over one another, is by reaching out and trying to care for each other. It's huge. Therefore, says Paul when he writes to the church in Thessalonica, 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 11, encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are doing. In other words, what you're doing, keep doing it, do it some more, and then keep on doing it more, and then encourage those who've experienced that building up and that encouragement and that comfort. Encourage them to join in and be a part of this whole community of comfort, support, and encouragement, because believers aren't meant to come just because they're needy, and when they don't have needs, they just sit silent in the church. We're all meant to grow into this loving, contributing, encouraging, supporting family of faith. And it's meant to be so close that Paul is able to liken it to a physical body, flesh and blood, with the ligaments holding each other up, the stronger ones holding up the weaker ones. That's what it's all about. And so what I see is a community of support and encouragement, a support network, but not a social support network, a God-given support network. A support network where people who can depend upon one another in moments of crisis, where others can come in and find there are those here that they can build connections, friendships, relationships with, and find that they are there in their time of need. And that, my friends, is what we're talking about tonight, is the idea that as part of our resilience, We learn to stop trying to fight the fight on our own and stand our ground on our own, but we come and we embed with others, that we don't find ourselves absent from others and not making time to come and spend time and have coffee and do church with other people, but we make the effort to do that, and that in that space we find time to talk and find encouragement and to bring encouragement. It's a reciprocal thing, and it's all to do with being together. Just remember, two are better than one. That is a kingdom of heaven thing to help us renew our thinking, renew our minds, and be transformed. It's been great to have you with us. I'm trusting that you've got some benefit out of this, and I just encourage you to connect with a church near you. And if you're part of our wider family of believers or those who are taking an interest and watching online, I encourage you to consider coming and joining and having a coffee with us and just taking time to chat and meet some of the people and build some friendships. And if you're struggling because you've been let down and hurt in the past, then come and talk to some of the leadership team, and we'll point you in the direction of some really good quality, well-trained people in the congregation who can come alongside you and support and encourage you, and as you build a bigger support network around you. But that, my friends, is what God's plan for a household of faith is all about, is believers supporting one another, encouraging one another, and helping each other through those moments when we're feeling down. It's great to have you with us. We look forward to seeing you real soon. But for now, that's all we have time for. God bless. We'll see you soon.